I remember the motors whining before anything else, like a kettle about to boil and nobody turning the heat down, and my heart dropped when my prosthetic fingers started curling inward like they had a mind of their own, squeezing into my palm until I could feel bone under the skin. "Mr. Bennett," I gasped, voice tight and raw, "something's wrong with my hand." He didn't look up from his clipboard, he just mouthed the district line about testing rules like it was a prayer he was obligated to recite. The fingers kept digging into my hand, hard enough to make me taste metal, and heat began spitting from the wrist joint. I could smell burning plastic and my breath came short, fogging in front of my face. I had to move, had to stop it, but the room felt frozen around us like everyone was waiting for me to break the silence first. I begged him to let me hit the emergency release, told him the safety releases weren't working, the motors were overheating, the smell was chemical and wrong, but he only warned that touching the device would mean automatic failure. He said it like it was bigger than me, like a line drawn in concrete between rules and mercy. "Touching it means failure," he repeated, eyes flat on the clipboard, voice calm in a way that made my blood boil. The prosthetic spun past its normal range, and every rotation sent a lightning jag through my nerves, like someone flicking a live wire against my bone. Tears blurred the paper in front of me while other kids kept scribbling, some glancing up slowly as if they were watching a movie and not a person being torn apart. Someone screamed. A kid in the back stood up and said we needed to call 911, and for a second I thought help was coming. Then Mr. Bennett roared silence, his face reddening, veins showing in his neck. He sounded like a man who decided the rules were the only truth left and everything else was noise to be stamped out. The assistant proctor moved between the standing kid and me, arms crossed like a referee blocking a foul. I reached with my left hand, fingers numb and clumsy, trying to hit the tiny release button while the other hand grabbed my own arm like an enemy. The button was small and slick. My grip shook, the prosthetic jerked, and I felt the bones of the device grinding against each other inside my wrist. Smoke started rising, thin at first and then thicker, filling my nostrils with that sickening factory smell. My palm went numb, then hot, then raw, and blood began to beat at the sides where the fingers cut deeper. I remember thinking in sharp, stupid bursts, "Don't pass out, don't let them think you want it out of the test." I remember how the proctor's mouth moved when he said state testing protocol, like he expected that to fix the situation. I remember the sound of the motor's change pitch right before a joint cracked. Plastic popped, and a sliver flew off and landed on my exam paper like a dark, dead punctuation mark. When the hand slammed into my desk so hard the wood cracked, a hush fell over the room, broken only by the motor's high whine and my ragged breathing. Someone shouted that I was on fire, and the janitor pried a window shut somewhere and then opened it again, and kids started moving like a tide, half pulled by fear and half by rebellion. Mr. Bennett marched over finally, clipboard abandoned, face screwed up like someone tasting something sour, and he grabbed my wrist with both hands. I thought then it would stop because someone had physically intervened, but he didn't ease the pressure, he yanked hard. The sound that followed wasn't like a thing tearing, it was like a body giving up a secret it had been holding too long, wet and final. I hit the floor, my remaining hand scrabbling for purchase on a table smeared with blood and broken rules. People banged on the locked classroom door, chairs crashed, and the janitor swore under his breath when he fumbled with keys, saying something later about a 5-minute delay built into the system. The delay felt like a death sentence then. Someone outside kept shouting for an ambulance that sounded too far away. I remember thinking in the blur between pain and the bright lights in my vision, how did we come to value an exam over a living person? How did a piece of paper matter more than the person holding the pen? The answers didn't come then. Only the white-hot reality of loss, the taste of copper in my mouth, and the feeling that nothing about that day would ever be the same. The thumb joint cracked like a brittle promise, and the prosthetic flung open and then slammed down hard enough to crack my desk so the wood splintered under the force, sending a shock up my arm that was part pain and part disbelief. Blood came quick, dark and hot, seeping where the titanium post met my bone and tasting like everything final. "We need to get him help," Willie shouted from 2 rows back, voice raw enough to cut through the mechanical whining. For a heartbeat I thought help was coming because someone had said the word out loud. But then Mr. Bennett turned and barked about rules and consequences like a judge handing down a sentence threatening expulsion for anyone who intervened. His mouth looked small and mean when he said it. Destiny reached for her phone with hands that trembled, her knuckles white around the device, and she said, "Please call," but Mr. Bennett stepped in front of her like a wall, hand blocking the screen and saying, "No electronics, testing violation." He moved with that strange certainty some people have when they believe procedure covers them like armor. I could see how much it cost Destiny to stare back at him and not grab his arm. She mouthed that she was sorry to me, eyes bright and stupid with fear, then tried to move again and he held her shoulder and kept her still. The assistant proctor stood like a statue, not touching anything, as if touching would make the building collapse. I fumbled for the release with my left hand, thumb sliding over sweat and paper and plastic, trying to find that tiny button that was supposed to be everything you needed in a machine failure. My fingers shook so hard they felt foreign, like someone else's hands, and I could barely press. The prosthetic twisted in a way it wasn't built to, metal whining and joints protesting, and every motion sent a hot, electric pain up my forearm that made my teeth ache. The motor sound became a scream inside my skull. I remember thinking in a dizzy, focused way, hit it now, don't think about the rules, don't think about the test, hit it now. Then the fingers closed and something wet and awful ripped. The noise wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was a split second of wet surrender that made my stomach drop into my shoes. I screamed like I never had before, a raw animal sound that tore out of me and filled the room, and people who had been glued to their papers finally moved like the gravity in the classroom had changed. Chairs scraped and a desk chair toppled over. Someone shoved past the assistant proctor and lunged toward me. I remember the pain then was both everywhere and pinpointed. Hot and jagged where the device had been anchored, cold where blood pooled under me, and a hollow, roaring space where the hand had been attached. The janitor finally made it to the door and the master key clanked. I heard him curse about a 5-minute delay and how testing time locks had a safety built for the exam but not for this exact kind of thing. The delay seemed like a useless excuse then. The door burst open and a swarm of motion came in, the janitor, a couple of teachers, and a trail of kids who had stopped pretending earlier. Someone yelled for 911 and the phone calls started, but the seconds felt like hours folding over each other. I kept thinking about small things between the pain, how Destiny's face looked when she was trying to be brave, how Willie stood frozen with his hand over his mouth, how Mr. Bennett's face had gone a weird pale color when the prosthetic tore. They lifted me onto a stretcher with rough, efficient hands that smelled like bleach and rubber, and I watched the ceiling as the fluorescent lights stared down, steady and dumb. I tried to speak, but my voice shook and came out thin and far away. A woman with a deep voice said, "We need him conscious," and someone else slapped a damp cloth to my forehead. My family arrived later, faces wrecked and small, and the room filled with talk about surgery and blood and transfusions. I remember the ambulance ride in flashes. Sirens, my arm strapped and wrapped, a young EMT saying they were getting me to the best possible place. The pain kept a steady rhythm like someone pounding a stave into my arm. At the hospital they told me I had lost a lot of blood and that they needed to operate right away. Nurses moved with a kind of calm that felt like a different kind of power, efficient and human at the same time. They didn't talk about rules, they talked about veins and clamps and keeping me alive. Lying there, waiting to be pulled into a room full of bright lights and instruments, I thought about how close I'd come to not hearing those words again. I thought about a desk cracked and a test still lying on it, and I thought about the faces of the kids who'd watched it happen and what they'd tell other people later. The sound of the motor whistle was stuck behind my eyes, and for the first time I knew the day's shape wasn't just a memory. It was something that would move other people's lives from that moment on. The room turned into a storm in a second, desks flipping like rafts and kids running with faces I barely recognized anymore, panic painting everything raw and loud. Somebody started pounding the locked classroom door so hard the wood shook, and hands grasped the glass like they could break the whole world to get out. One kid grabbed a chair and hurled it through a window, the crash and the wind pulling curtains and papers into the hallway like confetti after a bad parade. I lay there between desks, blood soaking into the carpet and darkening my exam paper, and the taste of iron filled my mouth with each breath. I didn't know then how to measure time, everything compressed, seconds lengthened into bruises. Willie was shouting for help and Destiny was sobbing while she tried to help me, and people were moving in 1,000 directions but none of them toward the one obvious thing, how to save me fast. The janitor finally reached the door, keys jangling like some small defeated orchestra, and he cursed when the lock wouldn't turn because the testing system had a delay built into it. He told me later the delay was designed so kids couldn't leave the room early during testing, but in that hallway between rules and reality it felt like a trap. When the master key finally clicked and the door opened, the light from the hall sliced across the classroom, and then everything moved at once, teachers, aides, kids, and then the paramedics who rushed in like they had engines inside them. Paramedics worked with a machine rhythm, their hands quick and sure as they checked my pulse and wrapped my arm. Somebody kept yelling that Mr. Bennett had been taken outside by the police, and they had handcuffed him in the parking lot with my prosthetic still hanging from his hand like a grotesque trophy. I heard that and then everything blurred and folded onto itself because the world had somehow compressed the worst parts of certainty into one neat, awful picture. They loaded me into the ambulance and the lights made my skin look like a faraway sea. The EMTs asked me questions in a slow, deliberate way because they needed me conscious, and I answered when I could. My family showed up in a rush, parents with faces I could read as if they were books I had loved once and didn't recognize anymore, and they climbed into the waiting room like hurt birds. At the hospital, they moved fast, the kind of fast that doesn't feel like panic but like trained hands steering a ship through a storm. They wheeled me into surgery, and I remember being cold and disoriented, and then a bright tunnel of light and the odd comfort of people who knew what to do. The first operation was brutal in its simplicity. Stop the bleeding, seal the body, keep the heart doing what it was supposed to do. When I woke up, they told me I had lost almost half my blood. The nurses spoke in plain sentences: transfusion, stabilization, monitoring, and it all felt like words from another language said by people who were trying to build me back together. They took me back for a second operation to clean and repair what they could, to take out debris and make sure infection wasn't going to finish the work the motors had started. That one lasted hours, and when I came out of it, my arm looked foreign to me, dressed in gauze and stitched and bandaged like someone else's property. The surgeons explained gently about tissue salvage and contamination from the device, and I tried to keep my voice steady as they explained the timeline for recovery and the need for a third procedure. The third surgery was about future hope and planning more than immediate life-saving. They prepared the area for possible reconstruction someday, moving tissue around and placing hardware to make future prosthetics more viable. I learned then what it meant to be given a second chance that still felt partial. They told me if we had been delayed any longer, I wouldn't have woken up. I held on to that fact in the nights that followed, a hard, ugly lifeline that seemed to both forgive and accuse everyone involved. The police kept asking questions and took pictures, and the hospital staff made a record of everything for the detective who would come later. My family didn't leave my side for the first 2 days. They slept in chairs with exhaustion carved into their faces. Friends and classmates sent messages that slipped through my fog in bursts, some guilt, some anger, a lot of shock, and the school district started a press scramble that smelled thinly of scripted concern. Lying in that hospital bed, I kept replaying the moment the prosthetic snapped and the sound of wood cracking under its force. The image of Mr. Bennett walking in the parking lot with my prosthetic still attached to him like proof of his triumph stayed with me and fueled a burning, strange mix of grief and purpose. The surgeries patched up what they could, but the pain and the sudden absence of something that had been part of me since before I could remember didn't go away with bandages. They told me about transfusions and monitoring my vitals and giving antibiotics, all of it necessary but still not an answer to the why of it. The why would come later, in courtrooms and depositions and policy meetings, but in the hours after surgery the why had only one answer. I was here, and the rest of it needed to be fixed. I woke up to bright lights and the smell of antiseptic, and the first thing I heard was a detective asking me to tell everything again, every awful second laid out like a film strip. "Start at the motors," he said, pen tapping on his notepad, and I did because that was how it had all started for me. The whining, the heat, the smell of burning plastic that felt like a warning I couldn't fix. My parents sat on either side of the bed, faces worn and hollow, holding my hands like they could glue me back together. I tried to describe the sound of the motors, the way the prosthetic curled into my palm, and how Mr. Bennett repeated state testing protocol like a shield while smoke rose, and I asked for help. The detective wrote everything down without flinching, asking precise questions, timing exact words, who tried to help, who blocked them. I told him about Destiny reaching for her phone and being stopped, about Willie shouting, about the janitor and the master key delay, and about the moment the prosthetic tore. "Did you touch the device?" he asked, and I told him the truth. My left hand had tried the release, but my fingers shook too hard and the emergency couldn't be stopped that way. He asked about the classroom video, and I told him it existed and that kids had filmed it. He asked about Mr. Bennett, and I said what I had seen: a man in a parking lot clutching my shattered prosthetic like a grim souvenir. Later that day, a district representative came in, a professional with a folder and a practiced smile, and read a prepared statement about an internal review and concern for student safety. "We are conducting a full review and are committed to learning from this," she said, eyes never meeting mine, voice calibrated for cameras that weren't in the room. I told her to sit down and stop reading like it would fix my arm. She shifted and left more quickly than she arrived, leaving a stack of pamphlets and a card with a number no one answered when I called. It felt like a theater of well-rehearsed lines that didn't touch the bruise of reality in my bandages. That evening, the classroom video leaked online and everything changed in a new direction. Comments split like a fault line. Some people were furious, calling the school criminal and demanding reform, while others were cruel and quick, accusing me of faking the whole thing to get out of a test. I read some of those messages through a fog of pain and bile and had to stop because the words cut. He staged it, one comment read. Another insisted I had tampered with my device. I thought about how easy it is for strangers to turn a person into a rumor and how loud that noise can be when you're trying to recover from losing part of yourself. Destiny messaged me that night saying some kids were getting threats for speaking up, and we both knew the aftermath would hurt a long time. Insurance became another battlefield. The financial counselor sat at my bedside and placed a printed estimate in front of me, $41,000 for a new myoelectric prosthetic. He explained how coverage decisions could take months and that approvals weren't guaranteed, using words like deductible and pre-authorization that landed like stones in my gut. "We can set up a payment plan," he offered, and I stared at the number and tried to imagine how a normal family like mine could make that work. My parents whispered in the corner about savings, about loans, about what they could do, and I heard fear in their planning. The hospital bills started stacking, and the idea of waiting for an insurer felt like asking for permission to live. Through it all, I kept talking to detectives and lawyers, describing the smell of smoke and the red-faced certainty in Mr. Bennett's eyes when he refused to help. Marcus Ellis, our attorney, told me discovery would take time but that the emails and records would tell the story we needed. In the quiet between questions, I tried to sleep, and my nightmares were full of the motor whine and a hand closing on my life. Friends came and told me about the walkouts and petitions that students had organized, and that helped steady me. Small movements toward change felt like matches in a dark room, and I clung to those sparks while the rest of the world argued and billed and watched. I wanted answers, and Marcus Ellis moved fast enough to make that want feel like action, filing discovery requests that ripped open the district's paper trail and forced things into the light. The stack of documents we got back was heavy in more ways than weight. It smelled like other people's excuses. I read the autolock policy first and felt my stomach drop. The policy said there was no override during testing. No override. That meant locks that would not be opened for minutes even in an emergency. When I read the janitor's message saying there was a 5-minute delay in the master key system during testing, I couldn't breathe for a moment because that 5 minutes had been a wall between me and help. We found prior complaints next, complaints about Mr. Bennett ignoring students' medical needs while on duty, complaints that had been settled or quietly moved around with notes like handled internally or transferred. One email had a line where a parent warned about a prior incident and asked for better training. The response was a bland "we will review." Seeing those pages made my hands shake and made the word preventable feel heavy and loud in my head. Marcus said, "This is what we need," and it felt like the first time anyone had put the facts in front of the district's posture. He reminded me there was more to prove than a broken device. Policies and choices had shaped what happened. Diego Marin from the prosthetics firm came to look at the device, and I met him in a sterile room full of tools and careful light. He handled the prosthetic with the kind of focus I wanted from everyone who had a part in this. "We've seen corrosion before," he said quietly, and then he showed me close-up photos of circuit boards eaten by water. He told me there had been a spill of a sports drink weeks earlier in the classroom, and while nobody might have thought much of it then, the moisture had found its way past seals and begun the slow work of corrosion. The lab analysis later confirmed water damage in the motor assembly. Corroded contacts had likely shorted under load and overheated the system, which would explain the motor's whining and the sparks of smoke I smelled that day. The district's legal team pushed back hard on that device angle because it fit a simpler story. A faulty product caused an accident. Product failure, their lawyers said in meetings and press statements, as if a single phrase could absolve decision-makers who'd chosen policies that locked doors and limited intervention. They wanted the narrative to stop at the device, to make it a technical issue instead of a chain of human choices. I remember the district rep saying, "We can't legislate every possible outcome," and I thought about how you don't need a law to save someone's life, only a willingness to act. Our team pushed back harder. Marcus focused on the autolock policy, the janitor's message, and the files showing prior complaints that had been quietly shuffled away. He used the discovery documents to paint a picture. A system designed to prevent test cheating that had no emergency exceptions, staff who had been warned about medical needs and not properly retrained, and a key system with a deliberate delay. "You built a trap," Marcus told their lawyers in a deposition, and he laid out how policies can kill by creating an action where people should act. We also used Diego's findings to complicate the district's device-only story. The water damage mattered because it showed negligence could be layered. A spill left unattended and a lack of maintenance on the device, plus policies that prevented immediate rescue, created a perfect failure. If the prosthetic had been serviced after that spill, Diego said, the short might have been prevented. If the autolock had been overridable, paramedics could have cut response time. Each piece of evidence threaded into the next like a chain. That phase of discovery felt like opening a sealed box. Every document turned up another question, and sometimes the answers were worse than the silence had been. I read emails where teachers had complained about test day procedures and got reassurances that training would happen soon. I read maintenance logs that showed no service after the spill. I read a note from an administrator saying they'd rather keep testing integrity than change lock mechanics. Those lines didn't read like policy, they read like choices. At night I would lay there and think of the 5-minute delay, the motor's last scream, the smell of burning plastic. Finding evidence didn't bring my arm back, but it turned the story away from rumor and toward responsibility. It made the case about systems and people, not just a device. Marcus said, "We don't need to prove a conspiracy, we need to prove a pattern," and that pattern was there in black and white. I wanted justice, but I also wanted change, so the next kid wouldn't be trapped in a room where rules mattered more than life. The community did something I didn't expect. They moved. Josh told me he was tired of sitting and watching grown people talk in circles, so he organized a student walkout that morning, and 300 kids showed up at the district office with signs and voices loud enough to crack glass. They chanted for emergency exception policies and for anyone who would listen to feel the heat of that demand. I watched footage later of kids standing on the steps, faces set, and thought about how ordinary people have power when they decide to use it. Josh stood near the front and kept saying into a megaphone, "No more rules over people," and the line landed with a clean, hard ring. Parents turned their shock into work. They collected signatures and pushed petitions that filled pages overnight, hundreds of names from people who wanted the district to change fast. I got messages from parents I didn't know, from teachers who felt cornered by bureaucracy, and from alumni who remembered the same rigid rules from years ago. The petitions asked for simple things: emergency overrides, clearer medical protocols, and immediate training for proctors and administrators. Seeing the names made my chest tighten because it meant the hurt wasn't just mine. It had become everyone's problem to solve. Marcus used the public momentum to push legal pressure. He subpoenaed emails and personnel files, and the documents brought forward conversations that had been private until then. Some of the emails were bureaucratic and dry, but others had language that made my jaw drop: notes about prior complaints, memos about maintaining test integrity, and a few lines that read like excuses thinly disguised as policy. Reporters picked through the files and started airing footage that had been taken in the classroom, and one clip became central. It showed Mr. Bennett saying plainly, "State testing protocol," before moving toward me. That video moved through the media like a white-hot brand. The footage changed the tenor of conversations. It wasn't just a story about a machine gone wrong anymore. You could see choices and faces and hear the words. I remember watching the clip with my family in the hospital waiting room, the image of Mr. Bennett's hands frozen in time on the screen, and feeling a mix of revulsion and relief that at least some of the truth was public. The district's PR started to shift too. No longer could they casually say the problem was only a device when viewers had watched a man decide protocol mattered more than a student. Facing that pressure and the legal exposure Marcus was building, the district's lawyers finally asked to talk. They came with a different tone than their prepared statements had shown in the early days. Negotiations began in a conference room with coffee-stained cups and legal pads. Marcus laid out the documents and said plainly, "This is not just about a piece of equipment. It's about policy and choices that made that equipment lethal in practice." The district realized quickly that the public would not let this become only about the prosthetic. Our demands included policy changes, victim funds, and mandatory training, practical things that would prevent this from happening again to someone else. While the civil side moved, the criminal case shifted under public pressure and new evidence. At first, prosecutors offered a plea deal that included probation and a license review for Mr. Bennett, but Marcus and I pushed back hard because that outcome felt like a shrug. We wanted accountability matched to what happened. After we pressed, and the detective's file included the classroom video plus witness statements and the janitor's message about the 5-minute delay, the prosecutor added a willful disregard for safety charge. That change made the criminal posture harder and the possible penalties more serious. It sent a message that a public official ignoring a medical emergency could be seen as criminal, not just mistaken. People noticed the change in tone in the courtroom and in the press. The community's protests, the petitions, the footage, and the legal pressure all braided together into a force that made officials rethink easy solutions. News anchors asked tougher questions, op-eds demanded policy fixes, and parents who had been quiet found their voices at school board meetings. It felt like a tidal thing. Once started, the energy wouldn't stop at a single hearing. Marcus said justice is slow, but it listens to noise. And I believed him because enough noise had reached the right ears. At home, I watched our life change shape. Support poured in from people who never met me, fundraisers started, local groups offered help, and Diego's firm agreed to back reconstruction later. The settlement talks and criminal filings didn't heal my arm, but they made the issue public and forced the district to reckon. In quiet moments, I thought about how close we came to silence, how easy it would have been for the story to die in paperwork. Instead, because students stood up and parents filled out petitions and lawyers subpoenaed hard copies of decisions, the story expanded into something that had to be fixed. It was messy and painful, but it felt like real work towards stopping it from happening again. They signed the settlement after weeks of negotiation, not with the hush money style I feared, but with clauses that actually looked like change, and I felt both relief and a strange twinge of distrust when the ink dried. The district agreed to install emergency override buttons next to every testing room door, bright and immediate, the kind you could hit without a master key delay. They agreed to mandate medical emergency training for all proctors and administrators, the kind of drills Marcus said should be quarterly so people wouldn't forget what mattered most. They promised a victim fund to help students who suffered during tests or whose medical needs were ignored, and they agreed to deadlines with penalties if they failed to act. Seeing those words on paper made the fight feel less like punishment and more like prevention. I remember Marcus tapping the contract and saying, "This forces them to change behavior, not just pay to hide it." He wanted structural fixes, not just money. I wanted the same thing, something to show my loss wasn't the end of a story but the start of a different chapter where the system learned to choose life. The victim fund clause was practical and small, but it meant families wouldn't be saddled with impossible bills while insurers argued and appeals dragged on. It meant kids wouldn't have to wait months or years to get what they needed. Destiny texted me a string of heart emojis when I told her, and I laughed at that and cried a little right after because it felt like a fragile victory. Mr. Bennett's criminal case closed in a way that mattered more than a slap on the wrist. He pled guilty to charges including willful disregard for safety, and the court revoked his teaching license. The judge issued a no-contact order and probation terms, and watching that happen on paper felt like a rare alignment between consequence and action. When his attorney said in court that he'd made errors in judgment, Marcus stood up and said, "Those errors cost a student part of his body." The prosecutor nodded, and the courtroom felt heavier for a moment, like the words had weight. It didn't fix the past, but it made clear that ignoring a medical emergency during testing had legal consequences. Diego Marin's firm did something I didn't expect either. They issued a voluntary recall on the motor assembly in my model of prosthetic and agreed to cover my replacement device as part of that process. The recall was technical language turned into real help. It meant other users would have safer parts and that their company acknowledged a design risk when exposed to moisture. Diego called me the day the recall notice went public and said, "We're going to make this right for you and for others." He came through. He and his team worked with our lawyers and the insurer to fast-track my new prosthetic. That didn't erase what had happened, but it removed at least one huge barrier to rebuilding. Installation crews came one morning and bolted red emergency override buttons next to testing doors. They looked ridiculous and comforting all at once, like bandages on a building. School staff went through new training with role-play scenarios where proctors practiced hitting the override, calling 911 and evacuating students. They practiced with mannequins and mock drills and paperwork that had teeth, deadlines and audits that meant if the district let the training lapse they would face penalties. Seeing administrators take a class and stumble through the first practice call felt odd and good. It meant the people who had been frozen in that room were now accountable to a new standard of action. At board meetings, the change wasn't always clean. Some administrators grumbled about costs, others argued the training would eat into testing time. Parents and students showed up anyway, some still shaking and some furious, and they pushed until the board voted to adopt the settlement terms. Marcus negotiated penalties for missed deadlines so the promises couldn't just turn into PR. I sat through those meetings, listening to people argue, and I felt like a strange kind of participant in my own recovery, part patient, part organizer, part witness. It helped that kids who had walked out were still organizing, checking in with the district and making sure progress reports were public. Getting a new prosthetic took time but felt like progress. Diego's company worked with the hospital and the insurer, and the replacement arrived under the recall program, myoelectric sensors tuned to my muscle signals and a wrist that didn't whine. Learning to use it was frustrating and full of small humiliations, but each little victory mattered. Opening a jar, lifting a plate, shaking a friend's hand without thinking. Therapy and medication helped with nightmares and panic attacks, and I learned grounding exercises that made mornings less sharp with fear. The settlement and the criminal outcome didn't make my arm grow back, but they made the world a little less likely to repeat the same rules-over-life mistake. Sometimes at night I think about the day and how everything led here. The whistle of a motor, a 5-minute delay, a clipboard held like scripture, and I hate the chain that formed. But I also think about the red override buttons, the kids who walked out, and the petitions that filled pages overnight. Change came messy and slow and imperfect, but it came because people refused to let it be anything else. I still carry scars, both visible and not, but seeing systems change because of what happened to me gives the nights where I wake up sweating a reason to go back to sleep. I didn't get back what I lost, but I helped build something that could save the next kid. That has to count for something. I wake up sometimes to the sound of motors in my dreams and jump like I'm still in that classroom, and the first thing I learned in therapy was how to make my body stop answering that memory before it takes over. I'm a man who thought he'd dealt with a lot, but trauma doesn't care about lists of what you can handle. It reaches into small things and ruins them. My therapist taught me grounding exercises. Name 5 things you can see, press your feet into the floor, breathe into the count. And those rules became lifelines the first few weeks when any high mechanical pitch had my heart racing like it wanted to run out of my skin. Exposure therapy was the worst and the most honest part. At first, I refused the testing room mock-ups Marcus and the school offered because that place still smelled like smoke and papers and fear. But I agreed slowly because I wanted to steal the power back from the memories. We started small. I sat in a quiet classroom and listened to recording of indistinct ambient noise until the sound stopped being a trigger that made me want to run. Then we brought in recorded motor sounds at low volume while I practiced breathing. You control the breathing, not the noise, my therapist said 100 times until it stopped sounding like a slogan and started sounding like truth. Panic attacks still came, sometimes out of nowhere when a can clanked in the kitchen or a blender hit the high note, but the breathing and grounding shortened them. I learned to name the feeling instead of letting it swallow me. That's panic, I told myself, and it made the waves pass quicker. Exposure meant learning to sit in a chair in a room with a mechanical hum and not let it own me. One step at a time, I learned my body could remember safety too. Diego's team worked on the new myoelectric arm like they knew it carried more than parts. It had to carry confidence too. The first fitting felt weird and small, like putting on a glove that belonged to someone else. The sensors read my muscle twitches and turned them into movement, and we practiced basic tasks until my left hand felt like part of me again. I started with something ridiculous, lifting a plastic water bottle without squeezing too hard or dropping it. Try a slow pinch, Diego said, patient and precise. And then I did it and the bottle stayed upright and the small victory felt larger than it should have. I took longer to relearn buttons and shoelaces than I expected. Opening jars was a battle at first, and I swallowed pride and let a therapist coach me through grips and leverage. You won't get mad at the arm, she told me. It does what you train it to. That line sounded simple until it wasn't, and then slowly it became true. I practiced every day until lifting a plate didn't feel like an achievement but a habit. Friends helped. One night a buddy stayed to teach me to tie a tie while laughing at my clumsy fingers, and that laugh felt like medicine. Meanwhile, the district actually implemented the safety changes we'd fought for. The red override buttons appeared next to testing doors, bright and impossible to miss, and training sessions filled the calendar for proctors and administrators. Parents and students kept pressure on the board until the vote removed those old autolock rules and required medical overrides during emergencies. Seeing administrators fumble through mock drills at first felt a little like watching someone learn to tell the truth aloud, awkward but necessary. Marcus made sure there were deadlines and penalties, so promises couldn't slide back into the dark. The neighborhood response didn't stop there. Parents formed review boards, students organized follow-up checks, and the victim fund helped families who needed immediate support while insurance processes dragged. Diego's firm handled the recall and worked with insurers so replacements came faster, and small local fundraisers picked up anyone who still hit a gap. The change wasn't perfect, and some meetings still felt performative, but the mechanical walls that had trapped me were lowered a little. People kept calling the district out when they slipped, which mattered because systems only change when someone keeps watching them. Months later, I slept through a whole night without nightmares for the first time in half a year, and waking up without the hot spike of fear felt like breathing in fresh air after being underwater. Justice in court and policy change didn't glue my arm back on, but they stopped the system from staying dangerously the same. More than that, I learned to live with the scars and the memory and to let small wins count. I began to feel like myself again, not the naive me before the motor whine, but a man who had been broken and fixed into something aware and stubborn. It doesn't end with the new arm or the laws. It ends with the steady mornings where I wake and do ordinary things without counting the cost, and that's enough for now.